Hello, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Today's episode is a unique one. It's a fan favorite. It comes from episode number 56, which is titled, A Truly WTF Story.
In 2016, a woman had just pulled into her driveway in her quiet neighborhood in Missouri when suddenly her passenger door flung open and in jumped a man she didn't recognize who was wielding a knife. The woman froze in terror, hoping this was just a robbery. But when the man spoke, she knew this situation was much, much worse. 10 minutes later, the police arrived at the woman's house, and what they saw in the hallway of the first floor shocked them. However, the real shocker came a week later when they realized who this man was and why he had gone to that woman's house in the first place. This story starts a bit slow, but then it spirals into madness very rapidly. And that is why this story has become one of the most infamous true crime cases in modern history. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please re-pit the 5-star review button's pitted olives. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was August 2016, and the weather in O'Fallon, Missouri was typical for summer, hot, sunny, and humid. 58-year-old Pamela Hupp, who lived in O'Fallon, walked to the front door of her neat little 3-bedroom house on Little Brave Drive, and she opened the door. But before stepping outside, she gripped the leash of the family dog and then looked around very intently outside at the other equally tidy upper-middle-class houses that made up her new neighborhood. Pam and her husband Mark had only moved into the Great Warriors subdivision about 2 months earlier, and Pam was still getting a feel for the community. After scanning the street and not seeing any people or cars that were out of place, Pam relaxed and then told herself to stop being ridiculous. It had been a tough few years, but soon she and Mark would have a new circle of friends and acquaintances, and she'd know all her neighbors by name or at least by sight. After all, while Pam and Mark might be new to this particular neighborhood, the couple, along with their 2 kids, had lived in O'Fallon for the past 15 years, and so knew the area as well or better than most of its residents did. In fact, when Pam drove their late-model SUV around O'Fallon, she didn't have to look too hard to find houses that she and Mark had over the years bought, renovated, and sold for a profit. Thinking of Mark, with his talent for building things and his passion for fine cabinetry work, Pam smiled to herself. Neither one of them had wound up achieving the dreams they had had when they had graduated from high school, but they had done pretty well for themselves in the house flipping business. Pam stepped outside and closed the front door of her house behind her. Then, as she walked down the gentle slope of her wide driveway towards Little Brave Drive, her 1-year-old puppy pulled at the leash, eager for Pam to pick up the pace. As Pam leaned back to keep her balance, she had a flashback to her teenage years when she was a cheerleader and a member of her high school's gymnastics team. Back then, she could have walked a dog and done cartwheels, both at the same time. Now, with the help of her beautician, Pam still had the blonde hair, but the 5'6" curvy athletic body that had attracted so many admiring looks when she was a teenager had since filled out to a comfortable and stocky overall roundness. But despite the years and the added weight, anyone who had known Pam back in her school days would probably still recognize her. She still had that same wide smile, square jaw, and slightly broad nose that made her features strong and distinctive. And when she laughed, it was the same loud guffaw that had often sounded through the halls of Riverview Gardens High School back in 1976. But Pam hadn't just been a good athlete, she'd also been a good student who got good grades. And going into her senior year of high school, she had been just as excited as her classmates about heading off to college. Except that a few of the admiring glances she got back in high school came from one of the most popular and good-looking boys at her school. And shortly after he had invited Pam to their senior prom, Pam wound up pregnant with his child. And 3 months later, Pam was married to him. And by the time her friends were packing their bags for college or some other post-high school adventure, Pam was spending her days inside of a small apartment looking after a very demanding baby. The marriage had lasted 6 years, And while it only took Pam 4 months after that divorce to marry another man, her second choice in husbands had been a lot better than her first. The second husband, Mark Hupp, was a quiet and very likable guy who was 4 years younger than Pam. He had graduated from the University of Missouri in St. Louis, then was drafted by the Texas Rangers professional baseball organization, who promptly sent him to play on their minor league team. But, like Pam's dream of going to college, Mark's dream of eventually getting called up from the minor leagues to the major league club, the Texas Rangers, never happened. So Mark had left baseball and fallen back onto his carpentry skills. And in 1987, the family of 3 added another member when Pam gave birth to their son, Travis. 2 years after that, Pam and Mark had surprised their families by packing up their young family and heading 1,200 miles south to Florida. For Pam, it had been the adventure of a lifetime. She and Mark had settled in Naples, Florida, where they bought and flipped a couple of houses, and they bought and sold some other properties. Pam went back to school and earned a degree in internet technology, and for 10 years, the Hupps enjoyed a comfortable life in the southwestern part of the Sunshine State. Now, using her free hand to push her short hair off of her hot neck, Pam couldn't help thinking about how much had changed since those early days. Even though Pam and Mark and the kids had enjoyed their time in Florida, both Mark and Pam missed their home state of Missouri. So when Pam's mother, who still lived in Missouri, started experiencing early signs of Alzheimer's, Mark and Pam felt that they needed to head back home and be closer to her. Alzheimer's is a brain disorder that slowly destroys memory and thinking skills, and eventually it destroys the ability to carry out even simple tasks like eating. So, in 2001, the Hupps sold their properties in Florida and moved back to Missouri, where they settled in O'Fallon. Once they were back, Pam had worked on and off for years selling life insurance policies for State Farm Insurance Company, while Mark continued to build up their real estate business. 9 years later, in 2010, Pam had filed for disability payments due to neck, back, and leg pain, but when her application was turned down, she just joined Mark full-time in the house flipping business. Now, their daughter and son both had promising careers of their own, and with the responsibilities of hands-on parenting behind Pam and Mark, Pam was hoping that this latest move to their new home on Little Brave Drive in O'Fallon would be their last. She wanted to settle down there. A sudden bark brought Pam's attention snapping back to her dog. She wondered how she would stop and have casual conversations to get to know her new neighbors if her dog was constantly barking and pulling her like this from one tree or bush to the next. A second later, Pam gave herself a mental shake. She had never had any trouble making friends. And if worry over a rambunctious dog was the worst of her problems, then maybe her life really was finally turning around and getting back to normal. Because for Pam, the last 5 years had not been normal at all. In fact, they'd been among the most difficult years in Pam's life. The difficult period had started back in January of 2010, 9 years after they had left Florida to return home to Missouri. That's when one of Pam's best friends, a woman named Betsy Faria, had been diagnosed with cancer. Pam had met Betsy when both women were working at State Farm Insurance back in 2002 and 2003. Even though Betsy was younger than Pam by 10 years, the two of them had similar outgoing and fun-loving personalities. Betsy even had her own side gig as a DJ, a little business she called Party Starters. As they had gotten to know each other, Betsy had come to rely on Pam as a confidant, telling the older woman all about the ups and downs in Betsy's marriage, which included a couple of lengthy separations from her husband. Once Pam had left State Farm in 2003, the two women naturally had less contact with each other, but they still kept in touch. In 2010, after Betsy was diagnosed with breast cancer, Pam and Betsy began spending more time together, and soon Pam was one of Betsy's core people who stood by her side and rallied behind her and her family during such a difficult time. And then later that same year, when the news came in that Betsy's cancer had gone into remission, Pam could not have been happier. But that happiness turned out to be very short-lived. Less than a year later, tragedy had struck again. Betsy's cancer was back, and this time it had spread into her liver. In late November 2011, doctors told Betsy, the bubbly and fun-loving mother of 2 daughters, that best-case scenario, she had maybe 3 to 5 years left to live. And that was only if Betsy undertook yet another course of aggressive and debilitating chemotherapy. And then, just a little more than 1 month after that dire prognosis, and only 2 days after Christmas, Betsy's family and friends received the terrible and shocking news. Betsy was dead. However, it was not cancer that killed her. On the night of December 27, 2011, the day Betsy died, police near the Farias' home in Troy, just a half-hour north of O'Fallon, had received a frantic 911 call from Betsy's husband, Russ, who told police that his wife had committed suicide. But when police arrived at the scene and saw Betsy, they knew there was no way she could have killed herself. While Betsy had been lying on her couch that evening at about 7:30 p.m., someone had taken a kitchen knife, walked over to where Betsy was probably sleeping, and just started stabbing her. And not once or twice. Whoever had stabbed Betsy had just kept on stabbing her body over and over and over again, plunging the knife into her back, her chest, her neck, her face, her arms. And then when Betsy had rolled off the couch onto the ground, the killer had grabbed her wrists and begun slashing away at them. By the time the killer was finished, Betsy would be left with 56 significant stab wounds across her body. Betsy's husband, Russ, would tell investigators that he had spent the evening with friends who lived 30 minutes away, and then when he got home around 9 p.m., that was when he saw Betsy on the floor. He told investigators that he simply didn't notice the 50-plus stab wounds all over her body. Instead, he just saw the slash marks on her wrist and assumed she had committed suicide. But investigators were not buying his story. And 8 days later, police arrested Russ for murder. And at the trial that followed, Pam had been called by the state prosecutor to testify against Betsy's husband, providing information about the couple's marital problems in the years leading up to Betsy's death. 2 years later, in December 2013, a jury only had to deliberate for 4.5 hours before convicting Russ of first-degree murder and sentencing him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 30 years. Now, even 3.5 years later, in the middle of a hot summer day, Pam felt a chill go down her spine. Pam felt like nothing in her life had been more traumatic than Betsy's death and that trial, especially since Betsy had listed Pam as the beneficiary on Betsy's life insurance policy. When Betsy made the change, she'd made Pam promise to take care of her daughters with the money. Pam had objected and did not want to be put in this role, but Betsy had insisted that it would be a disaster if her girls or Russ got that huge payout. And even after Russ's trial, it seemed like the emotional body blows just kept coming for Pam. At the end of 2013, Pam received a call from her mother's senior living community telling her that her mother, whose memory and overall health had been steadily getting worse, had died. Pam knew that people meant well when they told Pam and her other 3 siblings that maybe in this case, death had been a mercy, given the fact that their mother's Alzheimer's had gotten so bad she could hardly recognize her own children. But for Pam, that didn't change the fact that her mom had only been 77 years old, and that Pam herself had been one of her mom's primary caretakers. And even if her mom didn't always know who Pam was, their visits together had become a regular and predictable part of Pam's life. And then, 2 years after her mother's death, Pam was absolutely shocked to find out that Russ Faria's legal team had managed to persuade the courts to consider some new evidence in his murder case. The new evidence included documents that suggested the state's case against Russ had been built on a bungled investigation, and it would turn out this new evidence was enough. In November of 2015, just 9 months earlier, Russ, the man Pam had testified against and had played a big role in putting behind bars, was acquitted of his wife's murder and released from prison. Pam was horrified. With Russ now free, she couldn't help but feel scared all the time. Would Russ try to hurt her now, to get revenge for her testimony against him? After all, Pam had not held back in court. She had given up every single detail she could possibly remember Betsy telling her about how awful and abusive Russ was, and it really had an impact on the jury. And so Pam knew Russ must hate her. But now, as Pam turned the corner back onto her street and saw her beautiful new house in view, she tried to push those memories away. She knew what Russ looked like, she knew what kind of car he drove, and she had already taken her own precautions. She and her husband Mark, the year before, had bought a handgun, and recently she had taught herself how to use it. With one last look up and down her street, Pam hustled up her driveway with her dog, then opened her front door, stepped inside, and then shut and locked the door behind them. A few days later, on the morning of Tuesday, August 16th, Pam got up, she took her dog for a quick walk, and then tidied up her already tidy house. Then Pam took a deep breath and opened up her front door and stepped outside and began immediately scanning the nearby streets and houses. Luckily, she didn't see any strange cars or people or Russ, and so it was all clear. A minute later, Pam had hopped inside of her SUV, she had backed out of the driveway onto Little Brave Drive, she left the Great Warrior subdivision, picked up Route 70, and headed east. After she finished shopping, she planned to run a few other errands and then drop by her daughter's house. Just a few hours later, right around noon, Pam was pulling back into her driveway. It had been an excellent morning, even if it had turned out that Pam's daughter had not been at home. Pam reminded herself that even if her daughter had been there, they wouldn't have been able to visit for very long because Pam needed to get back home and let the dog out again. But as Pam was about to press the remote to open her garage door, she noticed a flash in her rearview mirror. She turned around and she saw a silver four-door sedan had come to a quick stop right in front of her house by the curb, and a man who she didn't recognize, wearing glasses and a black ball cap pulled down low over his face, was climbing out of the passenger seat. Before Pam could even process what was happening, this man had run up the driveway to her car, opened Pam's passenger door, and climbed inside the car with her and shut the door behind him. A second later, as Pam registered the squeal of tires as the silver car shot away from the curb, the strange man who was now in the car with her pulled a knife out and held it against her throat. Pam could feel the adrenaline flooding her body, and for a second she was too shocked to even move. As she sat there paralyzed with fear, the attacker began yelling at her to drive her car to the bank and take out the money she had stolen from Russ. Understanding suddenly dawned on Pam. Russ must have hired this man to do this. Russ wanted Betsy's $150,000 insurance money that Pam had been entrusted with. But then, as Pam thought of this, she wondered if her attacker would actually let her go if she turned over this money. And somewhere deep in her brain, Pam knew the answer to that question. No, this man was going to kill her. Suddenly, Pam's survival instincts kicked in. And using all of her strength, Pam struck out with her right hand and hit the attacker on the face, while simultaneously with her left hand, she fumbled to open the car door. Taken completely by surprise, the attacker lost grip on the knife and it tumbled down onto the floor of the car. By the time he retrieved it, he looked up and saw Pam was out of the car, running towards her garage. But as quick as Pam was, her attacker was even faster. Pam managed to get through the back door that led into the garage, but when she turned around to try to shut and lock it, her attacker had already thrown half of his body into the space between the door and the frame, forcing it open. And so Pam eventually stopped trying to shut the door on him and just turned and ran across her garage and opened the door that led into her house. Once she was inside, she made a quick turn to the right and sprinted into the master bedroom. At this point, the attacker had gotten inside of the garage. He went through the same door that went into the house, but as he went right, he ran so fast he overshot the door that led into the master bedroom where Pam was. And that mistake bought Pam just enough time to get all the way to her bedside table in her bedroom, open up her drawer, and pull out the gun she had put in there. And so by the time the attacker had corrected himself, turned around, and come into the master bedroom, Pam was standing there with the gun held out straight, screaming at him while dialing 911 with her other hand. The time was 12:10 p.m. as the dispatcher at the O'Fallon police station picked up that emergency call. The dispatcher could hear the voice of a woman on the other end of the line calling for help and yelling at an intruder to get out of her house. Then there was the sound of a scuffle and a man's voice in the background, and before the dispatcher could get the caller's address, she heard the distinctive and unmistakable sound of 5 gunshots, all fired in rapid succession. By the time police arrived at Pam's residence just minutes later, Pam was standing just inside of her open garage, clutching the collar of her dog, who was cowering and whining at her feet. And inside of her house, the man who had just attempted to kidnap and rob her was dead. By early afternoon, a very shaken and upset Pamela Hupp was sitting inside an interrogation room at the O'Fallon police station, giving police her formal statement, describing exactly what happened. And with hands that trembled, Pam pressed her palms together, extending her thumb and forefinger in the shape of a gun, and showed police how, when the man started coming towards her in the bedroom, she had just kept pulling the trigger of her pistol until she had emptied every round into that man's chest. And although Pam could not tell police who the man actually was, she did feel very confident that Russ Faria had to be involved. He likely sent him. She then explained her connection to Russ and why he might want to hurt her or rob her or both. As she recalled the details of the attack, Pam even thought that maybe the driver of that silver car that had dropped the attacker off, that driver might even have been Russ himself. It kind of looked like him, but she couldn't be sure. She only saw him for a second. After giving police all the information she could possibly think of, Pam signed her official statement, and then she was released. Just like Pam, detectives also believed that what happened to her had to be connected to Russ and his recent acquittal. But 7 days after the attack on Pam, investigators had discovered that while the attack on Pam was indeed connected to Russ, it was connected to him in a way that no one was expecting. Based on what the investigators learned, here is a reconstruction of the days leading up to the attack on Pam, as well as what actually went down on that day, August 16th. On August 10th, 2016, 8 months after Russ was released from prison and 6 days before Pam was attacked, 39-year-old Carol Alford was sitting on the front steps of the porch attached to her home in a trailer park just north of St. Louis. The weather that morning was hot and muggy, but Carol didn't seem to notice. She was wearing a long-sleeve lime green hoodie and lounge pants. Her only concession to the heat was that she didn't have on any shoes, and she was letting her dog wander around her little yard while she sat still, rather than the two of them going out for a walk. At around 11 a.m. that morning, Carol was surprised to see a car she didn't recognize pull up alongside her driveway. The driver rolled down the car window and asked if Carol was interested in earning $1,000. The driver introduced themselves as a producer for NBC's TV program Dateline and said that they were looking for people to help them with a reenactment scene that involved staging a robbery, kidnapping, and a 911 call. Carol thought this was a bit odd, but she was intrigued and she wanted the money, so she said, okay. At which point, the driver instructed Carol not to bring her car keys or cell phone. Carol nodded, but narrowed her eyes. Suddenly, this whole thing felt very off. She told the driver she'd be right back, and then she turned around, walked into her house, and into her kitchen. There, she opened a drawer and began rummaging around inside of it until she found what she was looking for, a folding knife. Carol slipped the knife into one sleeve of her hoodie and then walked over to the counter and took out a large kitchen knife from its holder and put that into her front pouch pocket. Then Carol picked up her cell phone, she silenced the ringer, and tucked her phone out of sight in her pants pocket. $1,000 was a lot of money, but there was no way Carol was getting into a car with any stranger unless she felt like she could protect herself. And so Carol, now armed with 2 weapons and her phone, walked back outside and climbed into the car. As the driver pulled back onto the road, they told Carol that they were doing the reenactment at a location that was just behind a nearby strip mall. But after driving for only a few minutes, Carol suddenly felt like she had made a terrible choice, and she needed to get out of that car immediately. So she told the driver that they needed to go back to her house for just a minute because Carol had forgotten to put on her shoes before getting into the car. The driver looked over at Carol's feet, and sure enough, Carol did not have any shoes on, and even though the driver was really annoyed by this, they agreed to go back to Carol's trailer. When they got there, Carol suggested that the driver pull all the way into the driveway, and then as soon as the car was stopped where Carol had suggested, Carol hopped out, and then as she walked towards the door of her trailer, she very deliberately looked up, making sure that the surveillance camera on the corner of her front porch was aimed directly at the front of the driver's car, where it would get a clear picture of the car's driver and the car's license plate. Carol would go inside of her trailer home and then come out a minute later, still barefoot. She approached the driver and said she'd changed her mind and did not want to do the gig after all. And then Carol looked again, very deliberately, at the security camera that was now peering down directly on both of them, and then Carol turned around and stared at the driver, suspicion written all over Carol's face. As the driver looked at the camera, Carol stepped back and pulled out her cell phone and showed it to the driver and said, "Yeah, I am going to call the police, and yes, that is a security camera and it's watching you." Without a word, the driver rolled up the window, pulled back out onto the narrow road, and drove away. And true to her word, Carol would call the St. Charles County Police. She told the emergency dispatcher that she just had a very strange encounter with someone claiming to be a Dateline producer, and Carol just wanted the police to know about it. 6 days later, on the morning of August 16th, the day Pam was attacked, the driver who had approached Carol decided to try a different neighborhood further to the south. 40 minutes later, the driver rolled up to a complex of plain two-story brick buildings separated by strips of lawn and central sidewalks. Scanning the scattering of chairs along the various entryways to the apartments, the driver spotted a young man sitting in the shade, legs outstretched in front of him, head tilted back as he looked up at the cloudy sky. In this man's world, $1,000 was a lot of money. He had 2 young children and not much in the way of income or excitement. So, when the driver rolled down the window of their car and explained that they were a Dateline producer looking for someone to reenact a robbery, kidnapping, and 911 call in exchange for what seemed like a small fortune, the young man did not hesitate. A minute later, the young man had hopped into the car, and then on the 17-mile drive west to Pam Hupp's house on Little Brave Drive, the driver of the car carefully explained exactly what they wanted the young man to do. "When you get there, tell her to give you the money. Make her drive you to the bank and get it for you," the driver told Lewis. "She's gonna try to make a call to 911, and things might get a little physical, but remember, tell her you are there to get the money. That's the most important part." By the time the car reached Pam Hupp's house, the driver's actor for the day was excited and ready to play his part in this reenactment. Little did he know, he was walking into a trap. After the young man had barged into Pam's bedroom, he had tried to follow the script and say the lines that the driver had told him to use, but as he did, he looked up and saw Pam was not only on the phone with 911, but was also holding a gun in her other hand and she was aiming it at his chest. The young man, believing this must just be part of the reenactment, continued to try to say his lines, but at the same time he began backpedaling into the hall. But before he got there, Pam began pulling the trigger. When police found the young man 10 minutes later, he was lying in a pool of blood, his head propped against a doorway. When police checked his pockets, they found a clear plastic bag containing a handwritten note and 9 $100 bills. Although the man was not carrying a wallet, cell phone, or ID, it did not take police long to find out exactly who he was. Running the dead man's fingerprints through their database of known criminals, police got a match to a 33-year-old local St. Charles man named Louis Gumpenberger. According to police records, Louis had had several brushes with the law back when he was in his early 20s, including a drunk driving charge and a few court entries that involved non-payment of child support for his 2 kids. By August 17th, one day after the shooting, investigators were knocking on the door of Margaret Birch, Louis Gumpenberger's mother. She had just gotten back from filing a missing person report for her son at the local police station. Margaret was devastated when police told her that Louis was dead. But when police went on to explain the circumstances of his death, that he had been shot after forcing his way into a woman's house, Margaret dropped a bombshell. What the police had just told her was actually not possible. Meanwhile, investigators from the O'Fallon Police Department were following up on another lead from the St. Charles Police. 7 days earlier, on August 10th, police had received a 911 call from Carol Alford, who described a disturbing encounter she had just had with a stranger who had approached her at her home and then tried to get her to go with them to act out this weird kidnapping robbery scene for $1,000. But at the time, on August 10th, the police did not act on any of the information she gave them. However, fast forward a week back to August 17th, the day after Louis was killed, and suddenly now, given the weirdness of Louis's actions and the statements given by Pam about what she saw and what she heard, it seemed possible that the mystery driver who had been rejected by Carol had simply moved on to someone else to try to wrap up in their bizarre scheme, and that someone else was likely Lewis. And so the police hauled Carol into the O'Fallon police station, and they showed her a lineup of 6 photographs of people they thought could be the mystery driver. And without a moment's hesitation, Carol reached over and tapped a particular picture. "This one," she said. "This is the person who approached me." 6 days later, on Tuesday, August 23rd, police had confirmed that yes, the person who approached Carol was the same person who approached Lewis. And because they had this mystery person's name and contact information, they decided it was time to go arrest them. It would turn out that when Louis Gumpenberger's mother told police that her son could not have forced his way into Pamela Hupp's house, she meant that literally. Louis had been in a terrible car accident in his youth that had left him with a serious and irreversible brain injury. The injury had left him with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old, which made him very gullible and exploitable, and the injury had left him with serious physical limitations as well. Most notably, Louis could barely walk. And so when Louis's mother was told that her son had run up the driveway and barged into Pam's house, Louis's mother knew that could not be true. Louis literally could not run. And it would turn out Louis's mother was correct. Louis did not do any of the things Pam accused him of doing because the story Pam told police about the attack on her had been a total lie. There was never a silver car that suddenly pulled up outside of her house, driven potentially by Russ Faria, that contained Louis, who had then leapt out and charged up the driveway to attack her. What really happened was Pam, aka the mystery driver, had become totally paranoid after Russ was let out of jail. And so, in her crazed, paranoid state, she decided she had to take drastic action to put him behind bars again to protect herself. And so she put together this very elaborate scheme to frame Russ for murder. Then she began looking around town for someone to kill. And she found Carol first, but Carol did not fall for the trap. And so Pam kept looking. And a few days later, she found Louis. And Louis immediately took the bait. Pam led Louis into her house on Little Brave Drive while reminding him that the scene they were about to reenact was just that. It was an act. So just say your lines and everything will be fine. And then once the pair was in Pam's bedroom, Pam said, "Okay, we're starting the scene now." And at that point, Louis began trying to say his lines while Pam called 911 and turned away from Louis and fished her gun out of the bedside drawer. The 911 operator would answer Pam's call and immediately hear her scream out that there was an intruder in her house. And then the operator would hear a man in the background, which was just Louis fumbling through his lines. And then the operator would hear Pam fire 5 shots into Louis's chest. After Louis was on the ground, either dead or bleeding to death, Pam pulled a note in a plastic bag from her pocket and she tucked it into Louis's pocket. The note was designed to look like instructions Louis might have been given by Russ. It said, "Get Russ's money. Kidnap Pam." Carol Alford would ultimately seal the deal that Pam was indeed the mystery driver and Louis's murderer. It was Pam's picture that Carol identified in that 6-photo lineup, and Carol provided police her security camera footage taken from outside of her home that clearly showed Pam's license plate on her car and her face as she drove up in her car to Carol's home on the day she tried to lure Carol to her death. And so, at 11 a.m. on August 23rd, police cars rolled into the quiet Great Warriors subdivision in O'Fallon, and just minutes later, they found Pam. She had just left her driveway in her SUV and had made it down the street before police cars surrounded her and forced her to pull over. Moments later, police approached Pam's vehicle and told her that she was under arrest for the first-degree premeditated murder of Louis Gumpenberger. But this was not the end of the story. Far from it. The reason Pam had been so paranoid after Russ got out of jail was not just because she feared retribution from him. It was also because Pam was afraid that the new evidence presented at Russ's second trial would reveal a new suspect in the brutal murder of her friend Betsy Faria. And that new suspect was Pam herself, the beneficiary of Betsy's $150,000 life insurance policy a policy that Pam had cashed and then given absolutely none of to Betsy's family. And not only had that life insurance policy been officially signed over to Pam 4 days before Betsy was killed, but also Pam, not Russ, had been the last person to see Betsy Faria alive. 5 years earlier, on December 27, 2011, the night Betsy was killed, it was Pam who had driven Betsy home that evening from her chemotherapy appointment. And it was Pam who had helped get Betsy settled comfortably on the family couch, likely just minutes before Betsy was stabbed 56 times with a kitchen knife. And right after that violent and gruesome murder, it was Pam who fed overly willing prosecutors unsubstantiated allegations that Pam claimed Betsy told her in confidence that painted Russ Faria as an abusive and violent spouse. It was also Pam who kept pushing the theory that Russ must have killed his wife in a fit of rage when he discovered he was not the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. And it was also Pam who kept elaborating on that story and bringing in even more damning testimony about Russ to the state's lead prosecutor, and the prosecution team ate it all up. But Russ knew Pam had been lying the whole time, and so immediately after Russ was acquitted and freed from prison, he directed his lawyers and the press to look at all the evidence in his wife's murder case again. And he started urging the courts to investigate Pam as the primary suspect in his wife's murder. And reporters and lawyers weren't just asking questions about Betsy's death. They were also asking questions about the death of Pam's own mother. According to the official police report, on October 31st, 2013, Pam's mother had apparently died of a fall from her second-floor apartment balcony. But in hindsight, that accidental death was starting to look suspicious. The autopsy revealed that at the time of her death, Pam's mother had ingested 8 times her recommended dose of the sedative Ambien. Not only that, the 77-year-old Alzheimer's patient had somehow fallen through, not over, the railings of her balcony. And not only was Pam the last person to see her mother alive, Pam was also one of the beneficiaries of her mother's $500,000 life insurance policy. Just a few hours after Pam was arrested for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger, detectives sat Pam down inside of an interrogation room and reviewed all of the evidence against her. After they were done going over it, Pam's only response was that she wanted to speak to her attorney. When investigators left the room to call her attorney, a video recording of the interrogation session showed Pam reaching across the desk in front of her and grabbing a ballpoint pen that she slips into the back waistband of her jeans. Video footage also showed that while Pam was sitting there alone, she repeatedly reached up and touched each side of her neck as though searching for the location of her jugular vein. If that vein is punctured or severed, a person can quickly bleed to death. When investigators returned to the interrogation room, Pam was waiting for them at the door, telling them that she needed to go to the bathroom. A few minutes later, investigators heard one of their colleagues screaming for medical assistance immediately. After walking calmly into the bathroom, Pam had taken that ballpoint pen she had stolen, and over again she stabbed herself in both sides of her neck and on the inside of both of her wrists. When officers opened the bathroom door, they found Pam kneeling on the floor in front of the sink, her forehead resting on the tiles. Her shirt was soaked with blood, and more blood spattered the floor and sinks. However, as dramatic as the suicide attempt was, the wounds she inflicted on herself turned out to be non-life-threatening, and so Pam was quickly patched up and sent to jail to await trial. 3 years later, on August 12, 2019, 61-year-old Pamela Hupp was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the first-degree murder of Louis Gumpenberger. 2 years later, in 2017, the medical examiner's office changed the official cause of death for Pam's mother from accidental to undetermined. A year after that, in 2018, the state prosecutor and judge who were involved in Russ Faria's first and badly botched trial were both voted out of office. 2 years after that, in March 2020, Russ Faria, now engaged to Carol Alford, the woman Pam had tried to lure to her death, was awarded $2 million in damages for the wrongful conviction that put him behind bars for 3.5 years. And finally, 2 years after that, in February of 2022, Pamela Hupp was officially charged with murder in the stabbing death of Betsy Faria. According to the prosecutor who was preparing the case against Pam, the motive for that murder was financial gain. If Pam Hupp is convicted of Betsy's murder, the prosecutor has said he will seek the death penalty. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please re-pit the 5-star review buttons pitted olives. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Hey fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious, today's episode is a fan favorite. It comes from episode number 72, which is titled Debbie's Last Dance. Today's episode is a fan favorite. It's called These People Actually Exist, and it's actually one of our very first episodes from back when we started this podcast. The audio from the story has been remastered. There is a very particular type of criminal that's often portrayed in horror movies, but who rarely exists in real life. However, as rare as these people are, they do actually exist, and when they decide to wreak havoc, there's often very little anyone can do to stop them. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask if you can borrow the Amazon Music Follow Button's phone just to make a quick call, but instead just log onto their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Okay, let's get into today's story.
Around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Danita Gillette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Danita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Danita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gillettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Danita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life. And sure enough, from the moment Danita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Danita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Danita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Danita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Danita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Danita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Danita's family assumed it had to be Danita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Danita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line, but instead she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, she shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Danita. It must have been a wrong number. Danita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Danita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Danita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Danita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Gallettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night after they were done eating, his pager went off and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street, and then he walked over. And when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Danita Gallette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Danita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Danita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Danita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Danita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Danita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. had that actually been Danita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Galette's household and filing his report on Danita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Danita Galette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Danita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Danita when she was alive, and she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Danita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Danita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and then they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Danita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happen for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening, unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting. This time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were 2 victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want. We'll give you all the money we have. Please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register. She pulled all the money out. She gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up. He put it right in her face and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, but amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the 2 gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were 2 young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Danita Gillette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Danita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When 2 young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the two men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the two men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, these shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Danita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those, and they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Danita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out. They're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself. We're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees. And at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road. And as they crossed over the road towards the 2 vehicles, they were illuminated by the streetlight, and Huber could clearly see there were 2 young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other 2 climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the Shadow stopped, and at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on. And immediately, the passenger door of the Shadow flew open, and one of the 2 men took off running. But the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield. And he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now. But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived, and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvalis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all four of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvalis was wearing Danita's flannel jacket and DeMarcus was wearing Danita's sneakers. Additionally, while these four were being processed at the police station, a call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered two guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all four of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other three talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and Marvalis were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other two liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them. And Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the two girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while Marvalis sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly Marvalis, as planned, came bursting into the room with his pistol held out in front of him. He aimed it at Joseph and told him not to move, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the four posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. Marvalis instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while Marvalis is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to Marvalis, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so Marvalis was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so Marvalis left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when Marvalis walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, he put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then Marvalis took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow, so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but Marvalis pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound, and his whole body began to shake. And so the other two girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom, and when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at Marvalis and said, hey, can I shoot him too? And Marvalis says, sure. And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun. She walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson. She repositions the pillow on his face. She pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger. but it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise. He's still shaking. And she walks over to Marvalis and says, "Let me use your gun." And so Marvalis pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber. And then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. Killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and Marvalis, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Danita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Danita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of Marvalis and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did. But then, simply because he thought it would be fun, Marvalis still just started shooting her. So he shot Danita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Danita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister Danita calling. But Danita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, the friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the 4 friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, Marvalis burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. Marvalis jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw Marvalis and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas, and without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. Marvalis and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, and realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning on December 26th, Laura, Marvalis, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and Marvalis waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and Marvalis that it was just 2 people inside, a cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and Marvalis go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for Marvalis to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss, and then the pair, on their way out, would notice Jones at the end of the aisle, and even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and Marvalis, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadow's tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and Marvalis literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away, she does not get shot, and then they just steal her car. Even though, by now, the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that 2 of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkerson's house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders. And the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Marvalis confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night on December 26th, Marvalis and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit, and when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Marvalis to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. But DeMarcus comes back over to the car, he grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Marvalis as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the two of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Marvalis told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Marvalis put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Marvalis and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line, and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these 4 people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Marvalis and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvalis Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection.
Thank you for listening. In 2011, a police officer spotted a woman on a busy street in Japan, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked at a photo on his phone and then back at this woman and thought, yeah, that's definitely her. He'd been tasked with finding this woman and bringing her back home. It was a pretty basic task, but he'd managed to complete it way faster than he thought he would. The officer rushed down the street, greeted the woman, and she confirmed that yes, she was the person he was looking for. So he led her back to his car, drove her back home, and that was that. However, what the officer could not have possibly imagined was that locating this woman and taking her home was about to unravel 25 years of unimaginable horrors and lead to one of the most bizarre cases Japanese investigators had ever seen. But before we get into today's story, you've likely noticed that we've uploaded this episode on a Friday. This is not a mistake. In fact, this is now our new normal. I'm now going to be uploading 4 episodes to the Mr. Ballin podcast each week. Mondays and Wednesdays will be exclusive brand new stories. Thursdays will be our normal remastered episodes, and Fridays will be a mix of new stories and fan favorites. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please replace the frosting on the Follow Buttons vanilla donut with mayonnaise. Okay, let's get into today's story. Miyoko Sumida raced down the sidewalk in Amagasaki, Japan, trying to will her body to go faster. Miyoko was 63 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run, and her lungs were on fire, and her legs felt heavy. Even though it was a cool day out, she could feel the heavy eyeliner and mascara she always wore starting to run down her face. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to just stop, but she knew that whatever she did, she couldn't stop. She had already waited too long. Miyoko darted across the street and rounded a corner. Ahead of her, the city spread out. In the distance was Amagasaki Castle. It was a white 17th century building with these graceful layers of traditional Japanese curved roofs, and it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, which was all low, boxy apartment buildings and factories and warehouses. Miyoko turned a final corner, and there it was, the police station. She ran inside, and she called out for help. A police officer came out from behind a window, and in between breaths, Miyoko blurted out the reason she had come. One of her closest friends had gone missing. But the officer just stood there and stared at her calmly and told her to please slow down. And suddenly, Miyoko became aware of what she must look like. A little old frail lady with crazy hair, panting and gasping on the verge of tears. So she tried to steady herself and calm down and start from the beginning. In a shaky voice, Miyoko explained that her next-door neighbor had disappeared. Her neighbor's name was Kai Oe. She was in her 40s, and she was a wonderful, caring friend. But a few days ago, Kai had gotten into a strange car right outside her condominium and nobody had seen her since. It was like she had vanished into thin air. And so Miyoko worried something terrible had happened to Kai, and now she wished she had come to the police sooner. The officer assured Miyoko that he would file a report and the police would look into this right away. But the officer also said that very likely there was a rational explanation here for why her friend had left. Miyoko began to breathe a bit easier. She told herself everything would be okay. The police would find Kai and bring her home. On November 9th, 2011, a week and a half after Miyoko reported Kai missing, a foreman and his work crew arrived at an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Amagasaki. This warehouse was only a few miles from where Kai had last been seen, but the foreman and his crew didn't know anything about that. They just knew this was where the job they had been hired for was taking place. They were supposed to move some cargo that had been left inside the warehouse to a new location. When the foreman led the crew inside, they saw this vast, mostly empty space with trash and dust on the concrete floor and cobwebs on the walls. There were a few labeled crates scattered around, and so the foreman told his men to start moving them out to the truck. And as the crew took each item out, the foreman would mark it off his list. But then, at some point, one of the workers noticed something tucked away in a dark corner of the warehouse. The worker walked over to it and realized it was this big metal drum, like a barrel that might be used to store oil. At first, he just assumed it was part of the cargo they were supposed to move, so he grabbed it and tried to slide it across the floor. But the drum didn't budge. The worker laughed at himself. He was a pretty strong guy, and he figured he should be able to move a single metal drum on his own, so he took a breath, squatted down, gripped the top of the drum, and tried really hard to pull it out of the corner. But still, it didn't move. A couple of the other workers saw him doing this, and so they joined him in the corner. Together, they all gripped the metal drum and pulled. And it moved, but barely. At this point, the foreman came over to see if he could help, and when he did, he immediately noticed that this drum did not have any markings on it. And he thought that was very strange, because the other items they had come to move had all been very clearly labeled. And so the foreman glanced down at his list, and he did not see the metal drum anywhere on it. This sudden mystery got the crew excited, and they wondered what might be inside of this drum. Maybe there was something valuable or illegal. The foreman thought about just leaving the drum alone, but if it was a valuable item that somehow didn't make it onto this list but was required to be moved, well, the client would be angry if it was left behind. So the foreman told his crew to open the drum to see what was inside. Then they'd figure out what to do with it. The men were all in good spirits and joking with each other as they pulled on the lid, and the foreman could feel his heart beating faster with the anticipation of what they might find inside. Suddenly, the metal lid came loose, and it clanged to the floor. The foreman and his men leaned over the barrel to see what was inside. And for a second, there was absolute silence in the warehouse. As the foreman stared down into the drum, it was like everything around him disappeared. Finally, one of his men let out this awful, strangled scream, and it was like it snapped the foreman back into reality. He fumbled to dig his phone out of his pocket, and then with a shaking hand, he dialed 110, the emergency line for police. Not long after the foreman made that call, the lead investigator on the case, Officer Sato, walked into the warehouse, along with dozens of police officers and forensic analysts. The foreman and his crew were still inside, but they had all moved as far away as they could from the drum. Officer Sato nodded at the men, but did not stop to talk to them. Instead, he headed straight for the drum in the corner of the room. And when he reached it, and he peered inside, he gave a long, sad sigh. Inside the drum was the twisted body of a dead woman. And there was something else inside of that drum that also horrified Sato. Someone had poured cement inside the drum, and it had hardened and partially encased the woman's lower body. But he could still see enough of the victim to guess that she was probably in her 60s. She had gray hair and wrinkles. Sato could also see that she had bruising on her neck and face, she was completely naked, and she was shockingly thin, almost emaciated. As Sato stared down at the body, he felt his stomach turn. There was a true level of cruelty in the way this victim had been disposed of that hit him hard. But beyond his emotional reaction to this, Sato was also confused, because this scene didn't make sense. It was like his victim didn't match up with his crime scene. If the body of this woman had been found in her home, he could have at least started to wrap his mind around it. Because approximately 1/3 of women who are murdered in Japan are killed by current or former intimate male partners. Most of those murders occur inside the home. But this didn't look anything like a domestic violence killing. In fact, Sato could only think of a few instances that involved covering up and abandoning a body like this. And all of those instances were connected to gang violence. In Japan, these gangs are referred to as yakuza, which is kind of like saying the mafia. Sato knew there were yakuza groups in the city. They typically engaged in financial crimes like extortion, smuggling, and prostitution. But there were occasional episodes of major violence, including murder. Still, yakuza violence typically occurred between different gang factions, not between gang members and normal everyday people. And Sato just couldn't imagine how the victim, this older woman, could have possibly gotten mixed up with the local gang. Sato called over a forensics officer. The forensics officer joined Sato and then stared down into the metal drum. He told Sato the bruising on the woman's face and neck suggested she had been beaten before she was killed. And her body had not decomposed much, which could indicate that she had been killed recently. However, they wouldn't know until the autopsy. Sato nodded and then stepped away from the drum and slowly walked around the warehouse, looking for more evidence. He didn't see any blood on the walls or floors, and there also weren't any rope fibers that would indicate the woman had been bound or held captive in the warehouse. In fact, other than the body, there really was no sign of any violence. But that lack of evidence actually helped Sato begin to form an early theory about what might have happened. He believed the victim was most likely murdered somewhere else, and then placed in the metal drum, and then transported and hidden in this warehouse. A few minutes later, Sato headed back to the police station. He knew he really needed the autopsy before his investigation would have a clear direction, because the autopsy would show him who the victim was. However, in the meantime, he decided that the way the body was disposed of was a decent enough lead to get started. The Yakuza had been known to leave their victims in metal drums, so he would start with them. Following day, members of Sato's investigative team fanned out to the dark corners of Amagasaki. So, back in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Yakuza had operated pretty openly in certain bars and restaurants. People could always tell the establishments where the Yakuza were running brothels, because there would be a scantily clad hostess at the door trying to entice customers to come inside, and then when those customers stepped through the door, the whole place would be lit with this strange bright pink light. And if they wanted to spend some money, they could go upstairs and pay for sex. But now, the Japanese police had begun a crackdown on Yakuza activities, passing a series of anti-gang laws and targeting different parts of their operations. And so, when Sato's team talked to people in the seediest bars and restaurants in town, they didn't really come up with anything. It seemed like the Yakuza were just laying low, not murdering women and stuffing their bodies into barrels. Sato began to worry that this Yakuza lead was just going to take his team to a dead end. But then, just a couple of days after the discovery of the body, the autopsy results arrived on Sato's desk. Now, the report couldn't answer when this woman had died. It was impossible to tell if she had been dead for days or months. However, the report did give the identity of the victim. Using dental records, authorities had identified her as Kazuko Oe, a 66-year-old woman who had lived in the city. Sato kept on reading the autopsy, and when he finished it, he found attached at the back was this additional report. And when he read this additional report, he was shocked. The report said the dead woman found in the barrel was the mother of Kai Oe, a woman who'd recently been reported missing. But that was not the craziest thing, because the missing woman, Kai, had not been missing at all. A few days after Kai's neighbor, an older woman named Miyoko Sumida, had filed a missing persons report, the police had tracked down Kai, just 20 minutes away in the major city of Osaka. And it would turn out Kai had been hiding out there using a fake name. Very suspicious. And so Sato quickly contacted the officers who'd found Kai, and they told him that when they'd located her, they had no idea her mother was dead. And so there was no connection drawn about perhaps Kai being involved in the death. And since it was not illegal for her to run away and hide out in a different city and pretend to be somebody else, Kai had simply been brought home and allowed to return to her normal life like nothing had happened. Now, Sato's mind began to race. He wondered if the case was really just this simple. Maybe it had nothing to do with the Yakuza. Maybe Kai had just murdered her own mother and then fled. Sato knew he would have to act fast, because Kai had already tried to escape once, and so he didn't want her to catch wind that he was looking for her, or she might try it again. So Sato quickly flagged down another investigator, and the two of them both ran out to Sato's car and sped through the city. When Officer Sato and the other investigator knocked on the front door of Kai's condominium, a short, nervous-looking man in his 40s greeted them. Now, the man was polite, but it seemed fairly obvious that he did not want them to come inside. The man told Sato that he and his family knew about how Kazuko had been found in the drum in the warehouse, and so they just wanted privacy to deal with their grief. But Sato told the man that he really needed to ask some questions, and they could either talk here, in his home, or the man and his family could come to the police station. The man turned around and scanned the apartment behind him like he was looking for something. Then he muttered something under his breath and turned back to Sato and said, "Okay, you can come inside." Sato and the other investigator paused to remove their shoes, then they followed the man into the front room. And Sato couldn't explain it, but right away, he felt like something was off here. He asked the man if he was related to the murder victim, Kazuko, and the man said yes, she was his mother-in-law. But then he quickly corrected himself and said actually she was his former mother-in-law. He was divorced from her daughter, but he still lived in the condo with his ex-wife, their kids, and Kazuko. This surprised Sato. Why would a divorced couple keep living together? But he just smiled and nodded. He wanted to keep the man talking very comfortably. And just because the living situation seemed odd to him, that didn't mean there was anything wrong with it. Eventually, Sato got to the point and asked the man if his ex-wife was Kai Oe, the woman who had gone missing and then returned. The man shook his head. He said he had been married to Kai's younger sister, but Kai actually also lived with them in the condo. The man paused and again looked around the room like he was searching for something. Then he turned back to Sato and just began to laugh. Sato glanced at the other investigator, and he looked as creeped out as Sato did. There was something so strange about this man, and it wasn't just that he clearly was very nervous. A lot of people get nervous talking to the police, so they were used to that. This weirdness was something else. Once the man stopped laughing, Sato asked him if Kai was home, and the man turned and pointed to a closed bedroom door. Sato got up and walked over to it, knocked, and announced he was a police officer and asked if he could come inside. There was a brief silence, and then Sato heard light footsteps from inside the room. And slowly, the door opened. And when Sato saw who opened the door, he had to consciously hide his shock, because the woman standing in front of him looked like a corpse. She was rail thin, and her eyes seemed hollowed out in her face. Sato could see there were stains on her shirt, and her hair was stringy and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He asked her if she was Kai, and she just nodded. Sato stepped into the room, while the other investigator stayed back with the man. In the room, Sato saw there was a plate on the floor with scraps of food on it, and also clothes were piled up in different spots. The room smelled sort of musty, like the door hadn't been opened in a long time. Sato wondered when Kai had last left her bedroom. The silence was broken when Kai said she knew why he was there. She had actually been expecting the police ever since she got the news that her mother's body had been found in that warehouse. Sato asked if she knew what had happened to her mother, and in a voice so quiet that Sato had to lean in to hear her, Kai said, "My mother took her own life." This absolutely stunned Sato. If it was a lie, it was a really stupid one. Because why would Kai expect him to believe that her mother had, put herself into a concrete-filled drum? Or was she suggesting that her mother had killed herself, and then Kai, or maybe somebody else in her family, had then disposed of the body by putting it in the drum? Sato waited for Kai to say more, but she didn't. She just went quiet. Finally, when the silence between them had become deafening, Sato asked her, hey, why'd you run off to Osaka a couple of weeks earlier? Kai seemed to force a smile, and then said the whole thing was a big misunderstanding. She had just gone on a quick trip and was surprised anybody even noticed she was gone. Now, this made perhaps less sense than even the idea that Kai's mother had put herself in the drum, but Sato stayed quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was sort of onto her. He was a big believer in letting people trap themselves through their own words. But before Kai could say any more, Sato heard new voices outside the room, and he turned to see 3 people outside in the front room approaching his other investigator. Kai told Sato that the 3 people were her sister and her sister's young teenage daughters. Sato gestured to Kai to come with him, and then the 2 of them stepped out of her bedroom and headed towards the front room. Sato introduced himself to the rest of Kai's family and then shot another look at his partner like, what's going on here? The sister and the children looked as bad as Kai, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. And when Sato asked them these same basic questions about Kazuko's death that he had asked Kai, he noticed their eyes dart back and forth like they were trying to communicate with each other without actually saying anything. And when they did speak, they all said the same thing, that Kazuko had taken her own life. Sato felt like this whole situation was just insane. He had arrived here thinking maybe Kai was involved in her mother's death, but now, after seeing Kai and her family and the unsettling way they were all living, he had no idea what was going on here. Why were they all so sickly? And why were they telling such transparent lies? Sato didn't know if these people were guilty or innocent, but he did know one thing for sure. They were hiding something. He told the family they would follow up soon, and then he and his partner stepped outside. And then once they were out there, Sato said to his partner that, hey, while we're here, we should speak to the neighbors to see if any of them have a clue about what is going on inside of that condo. They began knocking on doors, but the neighbors would just say they knew nothing and then quickly retreat back inside. Now, this actually was not surprising to Sato. In Japanese culture, people were often reluctant to speak about other families' lives, especially if that family was doing something illegal or if they were mourning the loss of a loved one. But Sato had hoped he would have at least one opportunity for a helpful interview with a neighbor. He had looked at the missing person report that had been filed about Kai, and he knew that the older woman who filed it, Miyoko Sumida, lived right next door. Now, the investigators had actually already knocked on her door, but she hadn't answered. However, Sato figured they should try one more time before they left. After all, she's the one who filed the missing persons report, and so if anybody had more insight on the family, it would be her. And this time, when they knocked on Miyoko's door again, she did answer. However, she just seemed really scared and quickly apologized and said she had nothing more to say. Sato and his partner were about to just give up and leave when a young couple opened up their door and actually invited the investigators inside. The couple told them that months earlier, they had been out walking in a nearby park when all of a sudden they heard a woman screaming. And when they looked in the direction of the scream, they saw Kai, her sister, and her brother-in-law and their daughters beating Kai's mother, Kazuko. They said they had immediately called the police, but when the police arrived, they barely questioned the family. Instead, the officers had a quiet conversation with the family, left after a few minutes, and never followed up with the couple. This didn't surprise Sato either. At this time in Japan, domestic conflicts were handled very differently than pretty much any other kind of criminal investigation. It came down to the same principle of respect for privacy that made Kei's neighbors refuse to talk to them. Basically, police thought that family problems, even nasty ones, should be dealt with by the family. Sato was disappointed he hadn't gotten more information, but as he and his partner left the young couple's home, his mind began to race. Kazuko had been beaten before she died. There was all that bruising on her neck. And now, Sato knew that Kazuko's own family had been beating her. However, this didn't solve the mystery. In fact, it only tangled it further. Because after seeing Kai and the others in that condo, Sato didn't think they could actually physically carry out all the steps of Kazuko's murder. Kai looked so weak that it seemed like she could barely stand on her 2 feet, and the rest of her family wasn't much better. So how could they beat Kazuko to death, then transport her body to the warehouse and cover it with cement? Sato could not answer those questions, and he didn't even know where to look. The next afternoon, Sato was at his desk trying to figure out his next step when his phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the other end spoke barely above a whisper, and he said, "I have important information about Kazuko Oe's murder." Sato felt a rush of adrenaline, and instinctively he just stood up at his desk. He asked who the caller was, but the man wouldn't give a name, and Sato didn't want to scare him off, so he didn't press. The man said he didn't know how Kazuko had died, but he was certain that her family was under the thumb of a vicious Yakuza gang. And this particular gang had a ruthless leader, who was perhaps the most terrifying Yakuza leader in the whole city. After that, the caller hung up. Sato stood there in shock. It was like he had arrived back at the very beginning of this case, when he had stood over Kazuko's body in the metal drum and wondered if this was the work of the Yakuza. Sato immediately began a deep dive into the OF family's finances. He knew that almost all Yakuza crime just came down to money. And right away, a series of financial transactions jumped out at him. Over the past 2 years, the family had made repeated big payments at regular intervals. And when investigators tracked the group receiving these payments, they discovered a connection to the Yakuza. So, Sato began to believe that Kazuko's family had somehow gotten into debt with the wrong people, and Kazuko had paid with her life. And on November 26, 2011, which was just over 2 weeks after the discovery of the body, Sato rounded up 5 known Yakuza members in the area and brought them in for questioning. However, Yakuza members rarely ever talked to the police. So after 5 mostly silent interviews, Sato had no clear evidence linking any of them to the murder. And he still had no idea who this gang's supposed ruthless leader was. So by the time that 2011 ended, Sato had hit another dead end. And soon months went by with no new evidence coming in. And so Sato began to think that he might never know who killed Kazuko. On October 14th, 2012, so 11 months after the discovery of Kazuko's body, a pair of Amagasaki police officers approached an empty one-story house in a residential neighborhood. They were following up on an anonymous tip, very similar to the one that Sato had gotten. From the outside, the house looked like every other house on the block. But the second the officers opened the door, they knew something was very wrong with this place. The faint odor of something rotten filled the front room. The power was out, so the officers turned on their flashlights and headed down a dark hallway. The further they went into the house, the worse the smell got. Towards the back of the house, the officers found a room that was closed off by traditional Japanese sliding doors with wood frames covered in opaque paper. As they approached it, the rotten smell became almost unbearable. They braced themselves and then opened the sliding doors. Inside, they saw 6 large tatami mats made of thick woven straw covering the floor. Traditionally, shoes and socks would be removed before stepping on these mats, but the officers just quickly walked into the room, because they were sure that whatever they were looking for was somewhere inside of here. The rotten smell seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, so one of the officers crouched down, held his breath, grabbed the edge of the mat in the center of the room, and started to pull. And as the mat slid away, darkness opened up beneath it, and the officer shouted to his partner to come look. Under the mat, there was a hole in the floor, and when the officers peered down inside of it, what they saw made them want to run out of the room and vomit. Because at the bottom of that hole, partially encased in cement, were 3 naked, decomposing bodies. These officers quickly alerted Officer Sato, and it didn't take long for Sato to discover that these 3 new victims shared a common link with his original victim, Kazuko Oe. This link was a person who they were all very close to. It would turn out all 4 of these victims had been the victims of the Yakuza. There was a ruthless Yakuza leader who had overseen all of their murders. But Sato would soon learn that these murders were just the tip of the iceberg. This particular gang leader had overseen the murder of multiple entire families over the last 25 years. Based on evidence discovered at several crime scenes and from interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kazuko Oe. On the night of September 11th, 2011, 2 months before Kazuko's body would be found, the ruthless Yakuza leader reclined on a luxurious couch in a room filled with high-end furniture and artwork. The leader checked the time, and then picked up a phone and made a call. One of the killers answered, and without hesitating, the leader told the killer, "Now." Then the leader hung up, tossed the phone on the couch, and calmly waited. Not long after that, the 2 killers stood outside of Kazuko's bedroom, where she was fast asleep.
After a minute, they signaled to each other that they were ready. Then they opened the door and rushed Kazuko's bed and leapt on top of her. Kazuko woke up to the sight of fists flying at her face. She tried to fight off the killers, but they had her pinned down, and each punch left her dazed and writhing in pain. She tried to cry out, but she was too weak. The killers brushed away Kazuko's arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, and they kept on pounding her in the face, the neck, and the head until Kazuko just stopped fighting back. When Kazuko went still and the killers realized she was dead, they climbed off the bed and backed out of the room. Back in the front room, one of the killers called the leader to say the job was done. But the leader just laughed and told the killers to stay right there, because the job was not, in fact, done. The killers did exactly what they were told. They always did exactly what they were told. They stood there in complete silence, waiting. Finally, the front door opened, and the ruthless Yakuza leader walked into the condominium. The killers led the leader into Kazuko's bedroom. The leader stared at Kazuko's body, and then barked for the killers to move her to the bathtub and cover her with ice. The killers obeyed. And once Kazuko's body lay under a blanket of ice, the leader brought the killers back to the front room. There, the leader told them to write a suicide note, and to make sure the note included Kazuko's last wishes, that Kazuko wanted to leave all of her money, her possessions, and property to the Yakuza leader. The leader then told the killers that the last thing they would have to do was secure a metal drum, so that other members of the gang could transport the drum with Kazuko's body inside to a warehouse. The killers nodded silently. Once the plan was set, the leader smiled at the killers, and then turned around and walked back outside. And went right back next door to the condominium where they lived, and went back to relaxing on the couch. The ruthless Yakuza leader, who had ordered the brutal murder of Kazuko Oe, and who had presided for more than 2 decades over a secret and twisted reign of terror, was literally the last person Sato or anyone else had expected when this investigation began. Because the leader didn't look like some hardened criminal who could rule people through physical intimidation. Instead, she looked like a kind old woman. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was the 63-year-old woman who had rushed to the police to tell them that her neighbor, Kai Oe, had gone missing, and she was so upset about it. But to just call Miyoko a Yakuza leader would be a huge understatement. Miyoko was more like a serial killer and a cult leader. Over the course of their investigation, Sato and his team discovered that Miyoko's introduction to cruelty and brutality had come at a very young age. She grew up in Amagasaki during the chaos of post-World War II Japan, when the country was trying to recover from the devastation of the war. During that time, certain areas of the country bordered on lawlessness, and Miyoko's father had taken full advantage of that. Miyoko's father had been a very successful contractor who brought in North Korean laborers to work for him. He let those workers live in his home and eat his food, but he also beat those workers every day, took 40% of their wages, and threatened to kill them if they didn't do exactly as he asked. And so over time, out of fear and desperation, these men became completely obedient to Miyoko's father. And Miyoko had watched all of this very closely and even had begun to study her father's methods. Then, in her 20s, Miyoko herself entered into a life of crime, using a lot of what she had learned from her father. Her first major foray into the criminal world had been to buy one of those bars with the bright pink lights on the seedy side of the city that offered customers the opportunity to pay for sex. That had allowed Miyoko to meet members of the local Yakuzas and to familiarize herself with their tactics. When she was ready, she sold the bar and assembled a gang of her own. She recruited family, friends, and other people she trusted. Miyoko set out to get as much money and power as she possibly could, and using threats of violence from her gang played a role in her plans. But Miyoko went far beyond typical Yakuza violence to get what she wanted. Because just like her father, Miyoko understood that fear alone was not enough to own people. Her victims, they had to need her. In a way, Miyoko made her victims love her. To do this, she targeted families that owned property or businesses. She infiltrated those families by offering things like financial assistance to help their businesses grow.
And at first, people viewed her as a generous benefactor, a kind, wealthy woman who just wanted to help others succeed. But once Miyoko gained a family's trust, she used what some might call mind control to gain power over them. She would start by turning members of the family against each other, causing problems in their house or in their business, and then blaming those problems on one specific family member. And through her financial assistance, Miyoko would start to make that family feel dependent on her to survive, just like her father had done with the laborers. And Miyoko would also use her money as a way to get family members to do favors for her. These favors started out small and got bigger over time. And slowly, the family would grow more and more obedient. And while all this was happening, Miyoko would start to make rules about when a family could eat, when they could sleep, who they could talk to, and when they could go outside. And if any of them pushed back, Miyoko would order her gang to inflict serious physical harm on them. So using these methods, Miyoko was able to completely break people down mentally and physically to the point where entire families were terrified of her and also simultaneously completely loyal to her. And it would turn out Miyoko had used these methods to infiltrate Kazuko's family. That's how she got Kazuko's own daughter, Kai, and other family members to publicly beat Kazuko, like that young couple had witnessed in the park. But Miyoko's demands did not stop with forced beatings. Her ultimate goal was to take everything that family had. Their money, their property, their assets, all of it. And for that to happen, Kazuko would have to die, and then give everything to Miyoko in her will. But Miyoko did not want blood on her own hands. This was the horrifying truth that Sato and his investigators discovered at the heart of this case. Miyoko and the members of her gang did not physically murder Kazuko. Instead, at Miyoko's command, Kai and her sister beat their own mother to death. In manipulating Kazuko's daughters into murdering her and then willing over all her assets, Miyoko had imposed her brutal will, like she had done without consequence for years. But what she hadn't counted on this time was Kai's reaction. Because Miyoko may have thought that she had Kai completely under her control, like she had everyone else, but she was wrong. A tiny part of who Kai was before Miyoko came into her life had survived. After Kai had murdered her own mother, she felt instant regret, and she couldn't contain it. Now, Miyoko had noticed Kai's emotional turmoil, and she knew it posed a risk to her. So, on October 30th, 2011, Miyoko had left Kai tied up and locked in a car alone, debating what she should do with her. But Kai had managed to escape, and that's when she fled to Osaka and began living under a different name. When Miyoko realized that Kai was gone, she ran to the police station and played the hysterical, desperate old woman just trying to find someone she loved. She knew the police would immediately believe her, and she was right. And when the police found Kai, she refused to tell them anything. Remember, she was terrified of Miyoko, but she was also guilty of her own mother's murder. How could she possibly explain her situation to the police? So she just came home. And so by the time Sato visited the OF family condo, Kai had been locked inside of her bedroom, starved, and was getting beaten by her own family ever since her return. And Kai almost certainly would have suffered the same fate as her mother if that work crew in the old abandoned warehouse hadn't gotten curious about the unmarked drum mixed in with the rest of their cargo. It would turn out that over the course of 25 years, Miyoko had infiltrated and destroyed at least 5 families, including the family that was found under the floor. And each time, Miyoko had manipulated members of those families to kill each other or to kill themselves. In the end, police charged Miyoko with 8 murders, but they were only able to recover 6 bodies. And there are a lot of people who believe that Miyoko has been involved in even more murders. Kai and her sister were ultimately treated as victims in Miyoko's crimes, and they were not charged in their mother's murder. In December of 2012, while in prison, research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.